Okay, so I'm going to kick it off, and then Laura, I will pass it on to you. Okay. Okay, so hello all, happy Friday. Thank you so much for coming together with us today as we share data from the National Harm Reduction Coalition. My name is Laura Maddox. I am the capacity building specialist here at CDPH Office of AIDS, and I also manage the California Harm Reduction Initiative, or CHRI, which is what we'll be hearing a lot about today. I also work closely with my colleagues in the Harm Reduction Unit, Alessandra Ross, Leslie Knight, Marjorie Katz, and Matt Curtis. We at the Harm Reduction Unit, so we primarily address health issues for people who use drugs through efforts to build public health services, capacity, and support a policy for harm reduction programs, specifically syringe services programs. So NHRC, the National Harm Reduction Coalition, leads CHRI and funds 37 syringe services programs. And something that I like to state whenever possible, this CHRI initiative is actually the largest investment in harm reduction in California's history. So part of the ongoing evaluation of the initiative is the implementation of rolling point-in-time surveys. So these surveys, they're distributed by each syringe services program to their participants twice a year. And grantees completed their second survey in October of last year with a total of about 500 unique responses from 36 programs across California. So when Luca and Laura and Jessica shared the initial findings with the Harm Reduction Unit, we thought it would just be a really good idea to invite you, our government partners, to this presentation, because our work in government, it affects people who use drugs, for better or for worse. People who are experiencing homelessness, overdose prevention, epi folks, behavioral health, STIs, and infectious diseases. Like our work, it all intersects, right? And I can't think of any other project, any other recent project that collects information and trends directly from people who use drugs in California, with the goal, though, of hearing about their experiences, accessing and utilizing our services. So for those who are new to CHRI, what I'll do, I'll give a quick overview of the project, and then I will pass it on to the NHRC team who led the point-in-time survey. So the funding of CHRI was included in the 2019 Budget Act to support staffing at syringe services programs, and that also includes treatment navigation services. So the Office of AIDS established a contract with NHRC to provide technical assistance and fund staffing at syringe service programs. And they did that through a competitive RFA process. And that process awarded $12.2 million to syringe service programs throughout California. Now, this is important because, as I mentioned, there's 37 programs that were awarded. And out of the 37, 23 of the programs had previously never had sufficient funds to offer navigation services. So as you hear Luca, Jessica, and Laura share recent point-in-time findings, we at the Harm Reduction Unit, we at OA, we ask that you think about your program or organization's policies and initiatives, and then consider how they support or hinder access to services for people who use drugs. Then, next up, if you could identify an action to further support your efforts, or identify an action to address a policy that's a barrier to services. So on behalf of OA and the Harm Reduction Unit, we again thank you for being in this space. I will now pass it on to Laura. Thank you.
So I don't think I'm pinned, but I can just do the warmest welcome to all of you. It's exciting to see the range of departments and individuals that are joining us today. I'm the Senior Director of Capacity Building and Community Mobilization for California. We have an incredible California-wide team that has been implementing, along with our SSP partners and participants, this journey that is now almost 2 years in the making. And I think that the findings that Luca and Jessica will share with you today are going to be really, in some ways, a pivotal moment for all of the departments in California and all of our programs to start thinking, how can I further support this incredible harm reduction work that has been done in the field. It was done during COVID. We actually have had surveys done in the field during COVID, where our participants are sharing their expertise about how the landscape of drug use is changing, how much support our communities needs, and how can you all, again, as Lori said, start to change in the way in which you can support our efforts. So with not much ado, I'm going to pass it to Luca Bayer, who has joined us in October as a researcher and an incredible partner in this journey. So Luca, take it on. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. It's lovely to see all of you here today. I really appreciate it. As Laura mentioned, we're going to jump into some of the results from our point in time survey data. The most recent round we did is our second one. So we do these every 6 months. And we're going to kind of jump through a couple of the results and some key takeaways. Yeah, you can see we're going to sort of introduce this, go over the survey, talk about some of the results. We want to leave some time at the end for questions or discussions, but also if you have questions during the presentation, feel free to ask them in the chat. And we're going to take 2 breaks through the presentation to kind of allow folks to ask maybe briefer questions or clarifications. So feel free to kind of throw anything out that you want. Yeah. As Loris mentioned, CHRI is this incredible funding opportunity for harm reduction programs, and HRC kind of administers it through resources, support, and grants. And then my job, sorry, I didn't just introduce myself. My name is Luca. I'm a drug researcher, I'm an IV drug user, and I'm an evaluation consultant for the CHRI initiative. So what I do is help NHRC gather feedback and data from drug users and participants using tools like our semi-annual point in time survey. Before I kind of jump into the results in the survey, I wanted to kind of pose a couple general strategic questions and talk a little bit about collecting data from drug users. So the way that we've been approaching collecting data from drug users in this context, and the way that I think we should be approaching this entirely, is treating drug users like what we are, which is the world's foremost experts on drugs and drug use. We're not looking to collect just individual bits of information from drug users. We should be asking them for their expertise and their knowledge. And that knowledge isn't just individual, it's a collective awareness and consciousness of what's happening at a community level, at a statewide level. There is no one in the world who is more equipped to share expertise about drugs and drug use than drug users. So sort of with that in mind, I wanted to kind of pose a couple broad strategic questions that folks should hopefully kind of consider and think about as we go through this presentation. The first is just how can these results, how can what you're seeing on the screen today influence and inform your work, and how can it to support and serve drug users? Then on a kind of broader level, I'd like folks to kind of consider, like, how can your organization leverage drug user input and expertise to improve services and resource offerings? More specifically, it's great to kind of think about specifically what critical information is needed to inform best practices, improvements, innovations. Really consider like what your organization wants to know. Are ODs rising in this particular city? How many of our participants are on how's housing crisis affecting overdoses? It's kind of good to keep a stable of questions in mind that are the critical information that you need. And you should also kind of consider, does this information already exist? There's a lot of redundancy in this field. There's a lot of people asking the same questions over and over, getting the same results over and over, and oftentimes spending a lot of resources and money on something that you could solve by just turning to a drug user and listening to what they have to say. So it's always good when you're thinking about this data to just think, you know, is the information we need out there? That's an approach we've taken with CHRI evaluation, which is we don't want to ask questions that we already have answers to. We want to get a sense for what's actually happening on the ground with participants. And then in a more structural and methodological sense, does your organization already gather data from participants, and are the tools and techniques you use functional and efficient? The PIT style survey that we're going to go through today is one of the best tools that we have to kind of get rapid and adaptable data so that we can act on it without having to kind of go through the slower pace of more sort of scientific data collection. Let's see. So the PIT survey itself is a 24-question anonymous survey, and it's conducted by CHRI grantees to their participants. These respondents are part of a non-random sample, which means this isn't really like a scientific survey. We're trying to get kind of point-in-time counts of things. So we don't know who's previously taken the survey, so we don't get a good sense of whether we have a single cohort. Moving forward, we are going to kind of track that, so we will have a better sense of what is changing for a particular group of people over time. All our participants are compensated with $25, and the survey itself can kind of happen in person or over the phone. Down here below, I've kind of listed some of the major themes that we've approached and that we've tried to look at, but I kind of wanted to break it down in a more practical sense to just what are the questions that we're actually asking. So when we're looking at demographic data, we want to know the demographics of our participant communities. For housing, we want to know how housing access impacts participant well-being and needs. We want to know what drugs participants use and which drugs are available in their local area. For fentanyl, we want to know how is fentanyl being used by participants. The same for methamphetamine. And then we took a particular focus on services and resources for meth users, which we're going to talk about later in the presentation. And yeah, we just asked folks, what services and resources do you want to see provided by your local harm reduction program or by providers in your area or other groups, especially groups that many of you are leading and are part of, can kind of tie in especially to the responses we got from meth users. So when we put this PIT2 survey out, we got 500 unique responses. They were gathered from 36 grantee organizations, and we were able to tease out a bunch of qualitative and quantitative kind of data points. So we got 131 variables in the end. And those are kind of data points where we can see different indicators, different descriptions of the, of this participant community. Down below, this is what the data looks like in its final form. It's really just a full data spreadsheet of all of these different variables. And then we leverage that and use that to complete our analysis. To start with, we asked some demographic questions about participants. So you can see here, the median age is about 43 years old. That's to be expected. Usually when you're surveying drug using communities, it tends to trend a little bit older. We also asked people about their gender and sexual orientation. You can see here, we've got some kind of interesting dynamics. We'd like to maybe even out the gender balance a bit more in future studies. And we got an interesting amount of representation for bisexual, queer, and gay folks. We also asked people about how they identify, what race they identify as. And you can see here on the right, we've got that kind of broken down. About half the participants were white, 18% Black folks, smaller samples of Asian, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander. But as you can see, we got a significant number of American Indian and Alaskan Native respondents. This is usually a challenge within the realm of kind of drug research. Native and Indigenous folks are usually incredibly underrepresented within drug research, and they're also underrepresented with harm reduction context in general. So it was really exciting to see that we got 11.9% of our participants were American Indian or Alaskan Native. And this is because we have grantee organizations that are working on reservation, that are working with Native Indigenous communities, and that are providing services and support for them. And it's because of those groups and their hard work that we were able to get this kind of significant sample of American Indian, Alaskan Native folks. And I also just wanted to say, with the responses that we got from both participants and the work done by grantee organizations to deliver this study, I was extremely impressed by the responses that we got. We're in the middle of a pandemic. We're in the middle of a ongoing and horrific war against drug users. And still, we managed to gather 500 people together who were interested in sharing their expertise. And grantee organizations especially did incredible work to engage with all these folks, to ask these questions, to upload them, to help us kind of parse them and go through them. So all of everything that we're going to go through in this survey is really the product of hard work and a lot of dedication by participants and by grantee organizations. One of the main categories we wanted to look at is housing. And housing access and support for homeless and unhoused participants is a critical dimension of harm reduction. As most of you know, I know a bunch of you kind of worked in the housing space. Housing, harm reduction, and drug use is inextricably intertwined in this state. There's no way to disentangle them. if we take to drug use and harm reduction, it also has to be a housing approach and vice versa. And one of the things that we kind of noticed, we had used the federal definition, the HUD definition of homelessness, which is basically anybody who isn't living in a house, apartment, or room that they rent or own. We categorize them as homeless or unhoused. But we also ask people for very specific housing contexts. We gave a list of different housing contexts and asked folks to select the ones that applied to them. So you can see we got a lot of folks who were living in tents, living outdoors in the streets and parks, living in campers, RVs, and automobiles. And this is something which I think is somewhat specific to California. You have so many people who are living in campers, living in automobiles, living in vans. I think that's a pretty terrifying reflection of the state of the housing crisis, that you have 7 to 8% of people, or 16% of people at the end, living in vehicles. And the responses that we got about people's housing status showed kind of structural and especially kind of racial inequity within the number of unhoused participants. So while 75% of all our participants are unhoused, if we look at Latinx respondents, that jumps up to 82.8%. On the other end, though, if we look at American Indian, Alaskan Native respondents, they had the lowest rate of homelessness of anybody that we had looked at in this community. So we kind of get this interesting sense of distinct sort of demographic impacts and influence on housing status. Another racial dynamic was that the proportions for unhoused folks were roughly equivalent for white and Black respondents. So really we're looking especially at Latinx respondents, really bearing the brunt of kind of houselessness within this sort of survey population. Oh yeah, sorry, this slide did cut this off. We had about 25% of our respondents were Latinx and about 75% non-Latinx. I don't know why this has cut this off. Hopefully it won't cut things on further. Yeah, sorry. Let me see if I can make my screen a tiny bit smaller so that this doesn't cut off. Unfortunately, I don't know why it's doing this, but it's going to cut off. Oh no, everybody should be able to see it. Yeah. Excellent. So perfect. Thank you for pointing that out. So yeah, 25.7% Latinx, 75% roughly non-Latinx. And to jump into kind of the next indicator, we wanted to ask folks about the drugs that they regularly use. For regular use, we kind of use this definition of any drug that you use at least once a week. I've used that in the past for fieldwork and drug-related research, and it's ended up being a pretty accurate way to kind of categorize regular drug use. So the broad trends were that 74% of respondents regularly use a stimulant, 55% regularly use an opiate, and 35% were regular users of both stimulants and opiates. Now, this last one is one of the more interesting results that we got, because it really shows that there's a lot of overlap and there's a lot of commonality. And there's a lot of folks who are using multiple drugs, especially folks who are using methamphetamine and an opiate. So a lot of the combinations that we kind of saw, methamphetamine, as you can see on the right, was the most common drug amongst participants. But really, a lot of what we saw was people who were using methamphetamine and heroin, methamphetamine and fentanyl. And so we had about 58% of people who regularly use more than one drug. And we had a lot more people who regularly use 2 drugs, regularly use 3 drugs, even regularly use 4 drugs. But as I said, the majority of the polydrug use was heroin and fentanyl users who are also regular meth users. What was interesting as well is that we got a very, very small amount of people who said that they only use fentanyl. Almost all the fentanyl users, 95% of them, were also users of other drugs. Whereas with methamphetamine, we had a larger chunk of people, probably 20 or 30%, who said, I only use meth. Similarly, only use heroin. But with fentanyl, we saw a ton of overlap between other drug uses. One of the things I want to mention is a lot of the visuals in this and a lot of the charts were made by Jessica Smith, who did an amazing infographic of all of our PIT responses, which we're going to share, I think, later on in this call. But yeah, I wanted to thank Jessica for that because they turned out amazing. The next thing we talk about is overdoses. And we asked participants if they had witnessed or experienced an overdose at least once in the past 6 months. For this previous PIT round, We don't know what drugs people were using for those overdoses, how many overdoses they witnessed. That's something that we're going to adapt into our next PIT. One of the benefits of the point-in-time survey system is that you're able to adapt to emerging questions. You're able to quickly kind of sort of pivot and address questions that come out of the data. That being said, even with asking if they'd experienced or witnessed an overdose once in the past 6 months, 65% of all our respondents had witnessed or experienced an overdose, and 54% had used naloxone Narcan on someone. This is obviously far too high. This is catastrophically high, and it has been that way for drug users, certainly for the past 20 years, and especially in the past 10 years. It should be troubling and terrifying to everybody on this call that 65% of our participants are overdosing or witnessing an overdose at least once in every 6 months. Our suspicion is that that number is actually much higher in terms of how many overdoses people are witnessing. We also saw, though, distinctions between this sort of overdose rate within different types of drug use. So we had 81% of regular fentanyl users had reported witnessing or experiencing an overdose, compared to 70% for regular heroin users and 68% for regular meth users. Now, while that number of meth users is lower than for opiates, 68% is an incredibly high number for meth users, for regular meth users who had witnessed or experienced an overdose. We're seeing in various parts of the state right now that meth overdoses are becoming more and more of a concern, and that's been reflected in our data as well. One of the interesting things we also saw when we looked at people who use multiple drugs versus use one drug is that generally monodrug users had about 10% lower average rate of witnessing or experiencing an overdose. Part of that is due to the fact that most of the monodrug users are meth users, but the same effect was seen when we looked at heroin users as well. So for people who are using just a single drug, it seems like the exposure to the overdose risk is a bit lower. Inversely, there are other groups for whom that OD rate is much higher. Homeless and unhoused respondents reported witnessing or experiencing an OD 11.8% more than housed respondents. And within unhoused folks, different housing contexts appear to have different risks for overdose. People living in tents, streets, and encampments had a higher average rate than those living in hotels or motels. And for folks who live in vehicles, we saw that for folks who lived in cars, that number was much higher than folks who live in campers and RVs. And I think this probably reflects the fact that if you're living in a car, you might be living alone or using alone. And we know that overdose risk is elevated when folks are using alone, and there might be more people around if you live in a camper or an RV. But still, we're seeing the influence of different housing contexts on overdose risk within this data set. So I wanted to pause for the first time and sort of see if anybody has any questions they want or clarifications, at least on these topics that we've covered so far. I'd be happy to kind of answer or clarify anything folks want. If folks have longer questions, we will have time at the end to have a more in-depth discussion. All right, everybody's good? Great. So yeah, I'm gonna breeze through this. One of the things that we wanted to focus on, especially for this PIT, was looking at fentanyl use. As most of you kind of know or are aware of, the fentanyl availability and use is starting to approach or surpass heroin use in the state. This is a massive epochal shift. This is a huge transition that we're seeing in a drug market. And kind of what we're seeing is a significant displacement of traditional black tar heroin use by fentanyl use. And it isn't just people who are transitioning from injecting black tar heroin to injecting fentanyl. A lot of people are going from injecting black tar heroin to smoking fentanyl. And when we asked folks about the route of administration, the ROA that they used, for fentanyl, smoking was the most common ROA, not injection. So when we see this kind of transition from injecting black tar heroin to smoking powder fentanyl, that's a significant change. That's something that we're going to have to adapt to, but it is not entirely bad. There's a kind of, I think, somewhat hysterical discourse happening within media and even within a lot of kind of public health epidemiological specialists, treating fentanyl like it's this absolute monster and this sort of evil thing that we have to discourage. I think that that approach is unhelpful and in many cases kind of naive. Drug markets change, drugs change with them, especially when you have drug prohibition. Drugs are always going to shift towards more power in kind of less space. So we're always going to see things like transitions from heroin to fentanyl. And that transition has a bunch of benefits and potential challenges. And we're kind of hoping with the PIT survey and potentially with a lot of the work that y'all are doing to maybe go deeper into the nuances of what the challenges of fentanyl are and what the benefits are. For on the benefit side, at least, we're probably going to see a lot more or a lot less infections, probably going to see a lot less transmissions of HIV, probably going to see a lot less significant abscesses or needs for wound care, less skin infections. Altogether, there's going to be multiple benefits. Lots of people are having significant quality of life improvements when they transition from black tar injection to fentanyl smoking. But we also kind of wanted to ask people why, what the justifications were for that transition. Why had folks switched from injecting to smoking? And when we asked participants who had done that transition, why they did it, we asked them if it was because of a change in the, maybe a change in the purity or the strength of the drug, or was it a change in how their body personally reacted to it? Was it a change in the availability or the price of the drugs they regularly use? Maybe fentanyl is now more available than heroin in their area. And the majority of the responses we got turned out to be primarily market driven. The transition from injecting to smoking was more about what was happening in the local drug market. Availability was going up, price was going down, purity was going up, and that was causing people to make this transition from injecting to smoking. And one of the ways that we can kind of utilize that data, utilize this data about drug markets, is to look at how that's happening statewide. One of the incredibly, I think, impressive things about the CHRI, and about the PID is that we got a huge wide range of responses from all across the state. On the right, you can see just this broad map of how many responses we got from individual zip codes within different areas. You know, we had a spread of a couple responses from all kinds of rural zip codes, and then 20, 30 responses from the major cities within the state. And we ended up getting responses from 154 zip codes in 42 of the state's 58 counties, and responses from each city that had more than 200,000 people. So basically, I think this is an incredibly kind of wide and interesting cross-section of respondents. As you can see, it goes from north to south, east to west, covers most of the major urban areas. There's a little bit of kind of a gap in the less populated areas in the southeast of the state. But this is highly representative of the population of the state. And this allows us to kind of ask people questions about what's happening in their local markets. So we had to ask people what drugs were available around them. And as you can see, 88.9% said that meth was available, 86.6% said that fentanyl was available, 86.8% said that heroin was available. And what's interesting about this, aside from just the high availability of meth, is that you can see that fentanyl availability is starting to be roughly equivalent to heroin availability. And when we track this type of availability, knowing that kind of market factors are what's driving changes, we can get a good sense of how markets are adapting across the state, and maybe use that as a way to kind of predict when those changes are happening. So if we have more fentanyl availability and people are transitioning to fentanyl smoking because of higher availability, we can sort of use something like this PIT to get a further insight into how those changes are occurring.
Luca, there is a question in the chat. Any difference in moving to smoking in people who use fentanyl exclusively versus with other regular drugs?
Not in particular. When we asked the same question for meth users, whether they transitioned from injecting to smoking or vice versa. What we got was about an equal amount of people who had transitioned from injecting to smoking as transitioned from smoking to injecting. I think, especially with meth, that kind of crossover happens a lot, and people do adapt. Sometimes, sometimes injecting and smoking and just alternating those. But really, we didn't see any drug that was near to the responses we saw with fentanyl, where we saw, like I mentioned, we saw 36% of all regular fentanyl users had transitioned from injecting to smoking in the previous 6 months. If that trend continues, we're going to very, very quickly see fentanyl smoking entirely outpace fentanyl injection in the state. And that's also, from my professional opinion, what I believe will happen. One of the ways that we can kind of track these changes and look at them relies on the fact that drug markets and drug use is in many ways a spatial phenomenon. It varies by region, it varies by city, it varies by county. I know a lot of people here kind of represent organizations from across the state, and what's happening in your local drug market is going to be unique and influential, not only on that market, but on the ones surrounding it. So when we looked at fentanyl, heroin, meth, cocaine availability, what we saw was that basically in all the major cities, over 80% of people said that all of those drugs were available. So we have basically high drug availability for all drugs across most of the major cities across the state. When we look at it on a county level, though, we can start to see some kind of dynamics that are interesting. Because drug use is a spatial phenomenon, what happens in one place is highly influenced by the places around it. Rural communities are highly influenced by the drug markets of the nearest city. Kind of more rural counties like Marin here are influenced by what's happening in the drug markets around them. We can see through this map that fentanyl availability in San Francisco is higher than heroin availability. In Contra Costa County and Sonoma County, it's equivalent. In Marin County, fentanyl availability is a little bit less than heroin availability. My belief is that when we do our next PID 3, we're going to see higher fentanyl availability in Marin County because the counties that surround it are all seeing that trend, and these trends are highly spatial. We can also kind of use that same tactic to look at meth availability. So in this map, you can see this is county by county, how many respondents indicated that meth was available. What you see in the north and especially in the east of the state is that in these rural areas, meth availability is higher than 95%, which means over 95% of respondents indicated that meth was available in their local area. In the major cities like Los Angeles, San Francisco, Sacramento, it's a little bit less, more 86 to 95%. So we can see also the dynamics between rural and urban settings for meth availability. And because we ask folks about their zip code, we're not tracking any individual details from people. We're just asking them, what zip code do you live in? We have no interest in tracking where an individual is moving kind of through this data. But because we ask about zip code data, we can break it down on highly localized levels. We can see in zip codes in Los Angeles County, there are some areas where meth availability is less. There's some areas where we got 12, 13, 14 respondents, and basically all of them said meth is available in my area. So we can look at these patterns on a highly local level. We can look at them at a broad level. And that's because CHRI has managed to build this network of SSPs and harm reduction organizations across the state in this really, I think, broad and impressive way. Speaking of SSPs, we had also asked respondents kind of what their interaction with SSPs was like, what supplies they were getting. And we found that 71% of respondents basically always, usually, or sometimes get extra supplies for others. And that means that there's a lot of secondary distribution happening. People are getting large amounts of supplies to distribute to others. And especially in this COVID context, that's incredibly beneficial. We don't have as many sites open now as were open before COVID, but we do have a lot of people in our community who are distributing supplies. And I think even if you're not a harm reduction org, what this shows is really a willingness, especially amongst drug users, to do a lot of that work of secondary distribution, of providing supplies for them in their community, of being kind of liaisons and ambassadors between organizations and drug using communities when those communities might not want to interface or might not feel comfortable interfacing with your organization to begin with. What we also saw is that people who reported using Narcan and naloxone, people use Narcan to reverse opiate overdoses. It's gotten very, very popular in the past couple of years. We see Narcan being distributed in bars, in bathrooms, in lots of different settings, lots of healthcare settings. But really, when we looked at the people who had reported using Narcan, over 95% of them had received it from their local SSP. So even though it's really beneficial to have these distribution points for Narcan that are wider, SSPs still remain the source of life-saving Narcan and safer use supplies for the majority of drug users, or the majority at least participants in this study. What we also saw was that the people who were getting extra supplies were the people who were at highest risk for overdose and the people who were using Narcan the most. What this does to me is this proves the basic concept of sort of when people get a lot of extra supplies, it's because they need them, and it's because they're using them. They need the Narcan because overdoses are occurring, and they're administering the Narcan because they're there and they have it. What we also saw was this kind of troubling disparity in Narcan use and extra supply frequency between white and Black respondents. So when you look at the demographics of drug use, opiate use amongst Black and white respondents is roughly similar, but we saw far less Black respondents who were getting extra supplies from their SSP or were using Narcan. And that should indicate to us the need to improve racial equity in SSP service provision and in extra supply provisions, because oftentimes folks who aren't comfortable getting supplies from an SSP or who might feel stigmatized in that space are the same people who would be interested in distributing supplies for others who might feel the same way. Finally, one of the questions that we asked is, we really wanted to kind of drill down and talk to meth users about what was occurring in their communities and what resources they want and need. So as I mentioned before, we saw a lot of overdoses amongst meth users within this participant base. And we also saw a lot of meth users who were interested in changes, interested in changing their drug use, interested in receiving different supplies and services. So when we asked them that, we kind of got three broad trends. The first was people were interested in medication-assisted treatment for meth use. Lots of MAT options, medication-assisted treatment is focused on opiate use, but really we have a wide range of drug users who are interested in similar systems, interested in similar treatment modalities for meth use and stimulant use. People mentioned really off the bat, they're like, look, I would take Ritalin, I would take Adderall, I would take bupropion as a way of managing my meth use with a medication, the same way that Suboxone and methadone are used to manage opiate use. Lots of people just sort of focused on the fact that they wanted more medical supervision. They wanted less stigma in medical settings, and they wanted to be able to engage providers and say, look, I deserve and am interested in the possibility of medication-assisted treatment. Housing was the next big theme. Housing as a theme runs through all of our PIT surveys. Lots of people responded that housing was the largest barrier between them and either, managing their use in the way they wanted it, using it safely, or stopping use. Lots of people said, look, I can't even begin to think about changing my meth use until I have housing. And people wanted housing where they could be meth users and not have that put them in a precarious place relative to their housing. There's so much stigma in housing context. There's so much instability in housing context for meth users. Lots of people wanted to be able to access housing fairly and to use that housing without having to give up or pretend to give up meth use. We also saw a lot of people who wanted safer space for meth and meth users. This can be spaces provided by harm reduction programs, but it also links into housing. It also links into medical facilities. People want places to smoke meth and be on meth without getting into trouble, without getting hassled, without getting kicked out, without getting arrested. People wanted a safe space to stay, lay down while they're going through withdrawals or while they're overamping or potentially overdosing on meth, and wanted a space where they could come down off meth. And there are lots of different spaces that are pretty intolerant to having active meth use in their space. And that's something that's going to need to change and has to change, especially in light of the high rates of overdose within meth using communities. I wanted to do another quick break. Does anybody have any questions on these topics, what we covered in the last few slides? Like I said, there should be space for discussion at the end, but I'd be happy to clarify or answer any questions folks have about fentanyl, drug availability, SSP supplies, and services and resources for meth users.
Hey, Luca, this is Kevin Steer. And first of all, you are impressive. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
But I'm wondering, I saw in the regional trends, Marin has a higher income than some other places. Does income influence use in different ways?
I believe that it does. And that's one of the things that, that's outside the scope of PIT, but something that I think, these PIT surveys can be used as a springboard for further inquiry, especially since they are so adaptable, especially since they are so easy to deploy. We can look at these patterns and say, look, if things are changing in Marin County, we really don't have a good sense for why that's happening. Income certainly will play into it. We also saw a lot of people in Marin County who were unhoused and homeless, and oftentimes, those measures of income don't really take into account unhoused people, and oftentimes drug users, kind of in many ways evade the more traditional census taking. Even within spaces where income is higher, especially within kind of middle-class spaces and younger folks, we see far more fentanyl use than heroin use. Fentanyl use has become this kind of thing that actually has a kind of curve where it is often used by people who would have low income, and then it's also used by people who have higher income who smoke it or snort it because they don't want to do injection drug use. Stigma against injection drug use is much higher in higher income communities. That'd be my take on it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, like Matt Curtis had mentioned as well, those spaces in Marin County, also there's lots of migrant labor, lots of undocumented folks, smaller communities. Does anybody else have anything else they wanted to jump in on that?
I just want to add that what we see in San Francisco, the income divide actually exponentially puts our folks at risk. So I want to say that when we talk about, counties with a high income divide, same with overdose rate. San Francisco still has, it's kind of at the top of overdose rate, even though it's one of the wealthiest cities in the country. And that's exactly the issue.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. Okay.
Luca, can I ask a quick question?
Absolutely.
Definitely echo what Kevin's saying. This is a really amazing presentation. I wonder if there's anything else you want to tell us about smoking fentanyl. I was kind of curious, and you might have said this, but if there is any kind of protection versus overdose, is it easier to sort? Is that a factor as well?
Thank you so much for reminding me that. That was something that I meant to cover, but it skipped over. So one of the things that we want to look at really, really closely is the relationship between fentanyl smoking and overdose risk. My general sense, especially, as a person who smokes fentanyl and as a person who hangs out with a lot of folks who smoke fentanyl, my general sense is that a lot of the overdose risks are mitigated, partially because you're able to take smaller doses, you're kind of able to smoke something and then chill for a second, smoke more. Lots of people smoke fentanyl by using tinfoil and like an empty Bic pen. And if any folks are living or in San Francisco or in Los Angeles, you'll have seen this. Folks hanging out on the sidewalk, lighting up a foil, taking a hit off pen. At the end of the day, though, it's still a little bit premature to say exactly what the impacts on overdose rates will be. That is something that I think should have a huge amount of attention paid to it by researchers, public health folks, epidemiology folks who are looking at overdose as a dimension of health risk. We are seeing lots of improvements in quality of life in terms of abscesses, et cetera. I imagine that we're seeing a lot of people who are able to control dosage more. At the end of the day, though, we still need a little bit more input, or potentially if folks here, especially Matt, I don't know if you wanted to speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, Matt has his hand raised.
Just super briefly, we are soon to fund a project that's going to be partly looking at this and kind of looking at transitions to smoking and the effects of CDPH's support for access to safer smoking supplies. But just as Luca was saying, there's been it's still like a relatively new phenomenon. I think we've got local places like San Francisco where more prevalent fentanyl smoking has been around a little longer, but in most places it's quite new-ish. And we've got really pretty limited data so far. So for example, a study that I think got a lot of attention in harm reduction circles not that long ago was done by RTI that looked at fentanyl route of administration transitions in San Francisco, found these really amazing, striking reductions in injection-related risk behavior. So like an 83% reduction in injection frequency when people were able to smoke fentanyl, which obviously has all these health benefits that Luca was talking about, and found no difference in self-reported recent overdose rates. That doesn't mean there's no effect there. There's also, we just don't know. I think a lot of us have been hoping that there's a protective effect because we are for damn sure in need of more tools in the kit to stop overdose mortality, but we don't know yet.
Also, in the next round of the pit, we're gonna ask people more nuanced questions about overdose to try to get a little more of a sense of that. And I think that question of overdose risk and mortality is something that should be answered by a concerted effort that includes traditional academic and public health research. But also, like I said, the only way to get true clarity is to speak to experts. And the foremost experts of drugs are drug users. It is something where we can look at it through more traditional peer-reviewed style studies, but we also need to be constantly asking drug users and listening, hey, what's going on with overdoses relative to fentanyl? What's your perception of the risk? How are you seeing overdoses occur around you? How are those overdoses happening? How are they responding to naloxone? These are things which we can get by talking to people who are in the front line, who are up in it, and who know what's going on with more people than just themselves. Like Matt said, it's so, I can see reasons why it might raise risk. I can see reasons why it lower risk, but these other dimensions, especially like I know people who are lifelong black tar injectors, and injecting black tar is kind of rough. Like it tends to cause more abscesses and infections. People who thought that they would be injecting black tar heroin till the day they died, suddenly switching to fentanyl smoking and suddenly ceasing 30 years of injection drug use. They can hold down jobs better. Their abscesses and tracts are healing. Like we're just seeing massive transitions. And it's within this overall context of what's happening in America. The age of American heroin is coming to a close. Fentanyl is the opiate that America uses now, and it will be in the future. So yeah, to wrap things up, I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of takeaways that we got from this, and takeaways that might be relevant to partner organizations, to people working in public health and epidemiology. As far as housing, like I said, drug use and housing are deeply intertwined. Linkages and advocacy for housing justice, especially amongst drug users, are more critical than ever. We need housing organizations to support harm reduction. We need harm reduction to support and be linked to housing advocacy. And specifically, when we look at things like the high rate of homelessness for Latinx participants, we need to put specific focus on language access, on organizations working more closely with Latinx communities. As far as overdose risk for unhoused folks, we should be focusing on these specific contexts where overdose risk is higher, especially outreach to folks in encampments and outreach to folks who are living in vehicles. As far as drug use, every organization that works with people in this state is working with drug users. There is no community, there is no cohort, there is no scene, there is no cross-section of people on Earth for the past 5,000 years who are not drug users. Everybody needs to think and adapt to the notion of their community as a community where drug users are present. And for that reason, folks should be more aware of changes in local drug supplies and drug user preference. I think it'd be really good to read the papers, to ask people and say like, hey, what's going on with drug use locally? What's going on with the drug market? How are people using drugs? That kind of basic awareness can really help improve those types of linkages and that type of support. As we had mentioned, we need specific focus and support of awareness on fentanyl smoking, especially from a public health and epidemiology perspective. We do need the resources and the focus of people who are doing more traditional research to look at that from a public health perspective, to look at it from an epidemiology perspective. Yeah, Laura.
Yeah, with regards to this drug supply that we're presenting today, also remain open to what we don't know that could happen. We just learned in San Francisco that the latest 3 deaths by 3 people who have purchased cocaine. We talked to the medical examiner that confirmed that actually there was fentanyl in the body, and there was a survivor that could tell they were getting cocaine versus fentanyl. So that is a very new development in San Francisco. We have recently heard about the presence of nitazene, potential nitazene, which means all these new analogs to fentanyl that are even potentially more dangerous. And just to say in this particular call, the need for all the jurisdictions to uptake the surveillance of overdoses in a way that really we can quantify what's happening, because we have a lot of jurisdictions where still the counting of overdoses is very poor. So just to, in this context, with state partners, is to say a lot of work needs to be done from our jurisdictions to uptake also the way that they're, surveilling, because more maybe coming that is pretty dangerous and it's looking pretty, dark. So.
And that is one of these dimensions where engaging with drug user expertise is critical. About 4 or 5 years before there was any peer-reviewed or scientific focus on the adulteration of the heroin supply in the United States with fentanyl, drug users were talking about fentanyl in the drug supply. This was occurring years before people became aware of this on a wider level. When you ask, especially heroin users, they were saying, there's some new shit in the drugs, different colors, and we think it's fentanyl. If we had listened to that at the very beginning, we would be ahead of the curve by a couple of years, rather than tragically behind the curve at a horrific cost. We really need to be able to think of drug user expertise as a critical component of any insight we want to gain on what's happening with drugs in the state. Let's see. And, oh yeah, Laura, is your hand still up?
No, I'm done.
Okay. As far as overdose risks, yeah, like we mentioned, fentanyl smoking risks. We need more awareness of what's happening with these elevated levels of meth overdoses. Like Laura had mentioned, like we've been talking with medical examiner from San Francisco, who had mentioned that there was a significant rise in meth-related overdoses. That needs to be a primary focus going forward, especially considering the high numbers of meth users. Because we saw Narcan being used a lot by participants and given out a lot by SSPs, partner organizations should think about really allying themselves with local SSPs that provide Narcan. They can provide the training, they can provide the partnerships you'll need. They're highly effective. Really supporting harm reduction programs as they do overdose prevention is one of the best ways you can actually improve overdose outcomes in your area. As far then as changing ROAs, yeah, like I said, people should be aware of the fact that there's these shifts happening from injection to smoking. This shift is really interesting because it's never happened in that direction. People went from smoking opium to injecting heroin, but we haven't really ever seen this kind of switch from widespread injecting to widespread smoking. More focus on fentanyl, like I said, fentanyl is rapidly, displacing and overtaking heroin as the primary opiate for California drug users. As far as racial equity, we're seeing the negative effects of stigma and lack of equity and access for BIPOC and Latinx drug users who are at higher risk of overdose, who are at higher risk in Latinx perspective of housing instability. We need to be working constantly on racial equity within harm reduction and within the partnerships that harm reduction makes with other organizations, especially BIPOC folks who remain underrepresented in participant demographics and in leadership roles in harm reduction organizations. We are seeing how outreach, especially outreach from within Indigenous and Native communities, is improving health outcomes, is seemingly managing housing scarcity in a much improved way. And I think additional support and partnership for Indigenous and Native communities and organizations is something that will continually kind of improve well-being. And as far as meth, for folks who are working across the kind of broad spectrum of public health and just sort of medicine, we really need to look into medication-assisted treatment options and support for meth users. We don't want to be similarly behind the curve. If we're seeing a huge rise in meth overdoses, we need to respond to that immediately. And because we don't have a established treatment modality for management of meth use, we really need to focus on coming up with one. Similarly, anti-stigma efforts. Lots of programs and spaces are pretty intolerant towards meth users, and that has to change. Yeah, so to wrap all this up, I wanted to kind of go back a little bit to these strategic questions. Maybe as if folks have any questions or folks want to discuss anything, especially in relation to kind of the broader use of data to inform services and practices, and thinking about either what kind of data that could come out of something like a PIT, or what kind of data come out of some other data collection effort that would really be critical to kind of addressing some of the unanswered questions or the questions that are critical for the well-being of drug users. And yeah, that's that presentation. I'd love to take any questions if anybody has them. Oh yes, what's something Marjorie mentioned? When I said partnerships for SSPs, those are paid partnerships. SSPs should be compensated for the fact that they're sharing expertise as well. There's a lot more resources available in the institutions of public health than there are in the institutions of harm reduction. That inequity in resources should always be kept in mind as we build these partnerships.
Hi, Luca. This is Allison Hargraves from CPH Office of AIDS. I have a question that's a little bit maybe back to the beginning, but I think it affects kind of overall. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about your respondents, and I'm sorry if you said this before. I know it seemed like your partners in the field were the ones who were able to find your respondents for you for the survey, and I'm wondering if you can speak to those counties where we don't have respondents. Is that like, are those counties like with no SSPs, or what can we maybe infer about those locations, and maybe if we can speculate about what might be different or similar there?
That's a great question. Generally, I think it reflects the absence of an SSP in that area, or the absence of a CHRI grantee organization in that area. If you look at this map that's on the right here, all of these responses are coming from the counties where we got responses, the counties where we have. What was great is that we got tons of responses from each partner organization. 500 responses for a survey like this is huge, especially since it's pretty comprehensive. I think it's worthwhile to consider, if we want to expand into a broader area, that's a perfect justification for expanding CHRI. This initiative has managed to, I'm based in Louisiana. I normally work in New Orleans. My specialty is this one mid-sized city. And it's even hard to collect data on a citywide level. When I look at this map, this is incredible. California is larger than most countries. CDPH is larger than most public health departments in other countries. So we're really looking at a really broad representation. That being said, yeah, there's still blank areas kind of on this map. Some of them, if you look to like the extreme southeast of the state, a lot of that is reflective of the fact that there's very low population density there, but there's still need for SSPs, there's still drug users, and those areas tend to be extremely poor.
I just wanted to add also, especially in some of those southeast counties, there are no CHRI grantees, nor are there programs at all. So that's another piece of it. Not only do we want CHRI to cover programs in more counties, but we want more counties to have programs, period, that we can cover.
So if we look at here on this slide, this is the county-wide response that we got. Taking those zip codes, pulling them out, you can see we have interesting and good representation. But yeah, there are certain counties where either there's no CHRI grantee, or I think especially like what Jessica said, there are some of these areas that just don't have SSPs at all, and those are areas where people aren't getting any services and support, but also areas where we're just totally unaware of important things that are happening there. Especially drug availability tends to go from the southern border up. When we see drug trends, they tend to progress up the state from the southern border due to the nature of drug trafficking. So for that reason, what's happening in these southern counties and southwestern, southeastern counties is critical for understanding what's going to be happening for the drug supply of the whole state, and actually the whole coast, really.
Thanks so much.
Oh, sorry. Opened up Matt's link. Yeah, if anybody else wants to share any thoughts on, how can your organization kind of navigate around data, especially data collected from drug users? What kind of data do you think is critical? Like really coming up with questions of being like, we need to know how many overdoses are happening in this cohort, in this space. We need to know whether people are using fentanyl, in this county, in this thing. You can either kind of draw that data from existing sources by really kind of looking into them, or there's opportunities for you to kind of think about engaging with drug user expertise as organizations. Yeah, Matt.
Oh, I love picking on people on calls like this. So I wonder, I see Felipe Ruiz and Jared from San Diego County, where there's been a big effort recently to gear up to start new syringe services programs. And we've actually talked a bit about the CHRI evaluation stuff and some other things we've done as potential models or tools there. And I wonder if either of you could reflect a little bit on how any of this stuff is resonating, with your efforts on behalf of San Diego County to develop new harm reduction services there, if you don't mind.
Yeah, not at all. And thanks, Matt, for the ping. And Jared, please jump in also if there's anything that I'm missing. But like Matt was mentioning, we've been doing a lot of the formative work to hopefully establish the first SSP here in San Diego County. We've tried to involve as many people as possible in the way that we offer programs or the way that we structure a possible county SSP. One of the conversations, really nice conversations that we had recently was about data collection and what are those key topics that we need to consider when we do an SSP here in San Diego. And I think as you were going through the presentations, I think those are definitely aligned with what we want to do here in San Diego. I think just one of the key areas that came up is the issue of given the fact that it's going to be a first SSP and it's going to be, the first time that we try something like this after 20 years of a ban on needle exchange programs in the county, how can we make it easier for folks to fill out information and give us that really important piece of facts that are needed to not only improve programs, but also think about the future. So I think I think one of the things that we're really interested is what are those key areas, especially starting off a program, what are those key elements that we need to consider? And I think, as you were going through your presentation, Luca, which by the way was incredible. I think it's just borrowing from that methodology and really looking at those data points are something that we want to consider. I think, looking at demographics, looking at those modalities, those routes of administration, as you were pointing out, are key components that we need to consider for our SSP, hopefully. And definitely Matt has been helping us out a lot with this data collection, and he's provided a lot of input as well as local organizations. But it's that, those key elements, those 4 or 5 key elements that I think we want to use as a beginning point when we look at this data. And I think we're probably going to take this presentation back and really analyze it with our team and really define those elements that we could collect once we implement something like that in San Diego. Jared, I don't know if there's anything on this area that you want to add on the BHA side of things.
Yeah, thanks, Felipe. That was a great response of where we're at. Luca, awesome job, great presentation. This is definitely inspiring. San Diego, we've been, certainly as a governmental institution, have been way behind the ball in harm reduction, and we're catching up as aggressively as we can, given bureaucracy and culture change and all these things. And so, from the beginning, harm reduction work, this is what we need. We need to talk to participants. We need input from people who are living this, and that we don't have those institutions in place since we haven't been doing harm reduction work. So we're rapidly trying to, get new programs running and get new services running while intending to get that feedback like this incredible data. And I was struck by, talking about one of the big things Felipe has been working very intensely on, SSPs. I've been working on really ramping up the naloxone distribution here and looking at that health equity piece and being able to have that information when you're able to provide those data. So the takeaway here for me is I'm inspired to leverage what you've done here, but also to continue to get feedback and input of how we can bake in these data from individuals rather, as much as we can on going forward, given that we don't have the networks, we don't have the prior experience at an institutional level. So that's really what's been taken home for me. And I agree with Felipe that being able to take these data back use them, but also really use the approaches and continue to collaborate and learn from the good work that you're doing. So again, I'm really grateful. Thank you so much for this presentation and all the folks who were involved in this.
Yeah, it's really exciting to hear that work, especially being done in that space. The advice that I might give, at least from years of running harm reduction programs and then doing field work for research, really that notion of drug user expertise should really kind of be taken to heart in the sense of like, you can ask a single drug user about how many times they've overdosed in the past 6 months, and that will give you information about that drug user. But if you ask them, hey, what's happening with overdoses in your community? You'll suddenly get a perspective that includes hundreds of people potentially. And I think the traditional approach has been to distrust that perspective and to basically not listen to it in a way that wouldn't happen if people recognize drug users as subject matter experts. So I think, part of that is like also compensating them. This survey took about half an hour. So we kind of think of it as like, $50 an hour, which is what you get paid when you're an expert on something. And I think especially, there's great ways to very, very simply gather data from people. Once you establish that trust and respect, I tend to find that people, they like trip over themselves to try to give information, and especially if they feel, one, that information is being listened to and respected, and two, that it really could, informing folks to be like, hey, here's why we're asking these questions, and here's the impact it could have. When you really let folks know that their input is driving what's happening with your program, then you get a lot more buy-in, then you get a lot more engagement. At least that's been my experience.
Absolutely, and I agree. And it's something that those of us who, have an eye and some background in harm reduction who are here in the county have been stressing from the beginning. And so the I don't want to say the fight, but the tension there is how to do these, how to get that. That's exactly what we need. We need to get that rich data from the subject matter experts, like you say, and working within the bureaucracy to make that happen, competing with all of the bureaucratic measures we have to go through just to get anything off the ground, with being able to do that, that necessary work. So that's been the struggle, and it's baked into all of, our vision and our guidelines and our principles, but putting it into action in battle with sort of the stodginess of government administrative bureaucracy is the challenge, and a challenge that we're gonna figure out.
Yeah, I agree with Jerry. We're definitely going to figure out, and we're trying our best to figure out bringing that expertise. And the other thing also that Jessica also mentioned in the chat, and it was brought up during the presentation, is the flexibility of the data and how you collect the data and build it over the years. I think, giving us enough space to build that and make it in as part as the way that we collect the data, I think it's something essential. So I think, as we continue to consider all these data points and just the structure in general, I think the flexibility element is such a key component on how we inform not only our services, but how we collect the data.
Yeah.
I wanted to just say to Felipe and Jared that in some ways we make the choice at NHRC. We are grant makers for this initiative, and we could have just get grantee reports. And that is very important to us to track the journey of the enhancement of the work. But we decided, and we're a small nonprofit compared to county public health, but we decided that the meaningful involvement of participants was key. And that's why we added the PEAT data. But I also want to share with you that we are adopting the PEAT survey on a Latinx harm reduction assessment in San Francisco. So we have Carlos Martinez and another amazing researcher helping us. So if you want also, in particular, our PIT survey is in Spanish and English, but no in San Diego County. If you want some additional data, that is data questions that might be also more pertinent as they are assessing the needs of Latinx and Spanish speakers, we also have, I will call it a cousin PIT survey. I don't know if Luca knows this, but we adopted our PIT to meet the needs of Latinos. So more than happy also to share that survey tool with you guys.
Yeah, I think
Please,
that also,
thank you.
that brings us something that I mentioned that's really critical, which is that like there's a lot of redundancy in this space, like, and that redundancy takes up time and resources, huge amounts of resources, enough resources to start multiple SSPs and run them. So a lot of it's like, look, we want to adapt something like the PID to make it usable for other people. We want to be able to provide common frameworks and methodologies, and it's very possible. Like I took a couple lessons that I learned from doing a data project for a certain service provider in New Orleans and just adapted it for the PIT. And I think in a lot of ways, like when we build a flexible survey tool like this, especially one that we don't need it to be up to that peer reviewed level. We want it to be flexible. And we've really been able to we're doing this right now with PIT3, every time we sit down and say, hey, what worked, what didn't work, what was challenging for people. And it's exciting that every time it only takes people about half an hour. We keep this kind of slim, robust, adaptable thing going that I think we can share methodologically with lots of people.
Okay, we're at 10:17, and for those of you on the call, now's the time if you have any comments, any questions for Luca, now's the time to share. And I just gotta say, kind of just highlight what others were saying, Luca, the way you present and share data is amazing. It's absorbable and you provide the people's context to the numbers, and it's very good. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, if you have any comments, suggestions, or just any general questions that you'd like to have answered, now's the time.
Just to add one thing as well, like this, so much of this work was done as well by Laura and by Jessica and by other members of the NHRC team. And so a lot of what really makes this work was the input of lots of different people kind of making this tool workable and making something like this presentation possible.
Hey, everybody, this is Marjorie. I might be on a theme here today, but I just want to remind that all the programs, these are CHRI funded. So these are programs that are getting funded. So while it's exciting to get data and get input, and obviously incredibly necessary, as Luca has said, these programs were compensated for this. So be careful about taking all these great ideas and running with it unless you're willing to compensate the programs for doing the work.
Absolutely. I really, part of the whole model of thinking about this as expertise is to compensate and share resources in a way that's commensurate with that type of expertise. Lots of times drug users and SSPs, like there's this notion of like, oh, we need to invite them to the table, but that's nonsense. It's our table. It's our table, and anybody else who's here is a guest at it. And so I think a lot of that kind of inequity between the resources and stuff like that needs to be addressed, especially when you're thinking about leveraging or relying on SSPs to gather data, to deliver data, and relying on participants. I think, especially Margie, I think it's a great point. This is all happening within the structure of CHRI being a reality and us being able to support all these different organizations for their input.
Okay, let's see. I see a comment here, Laura. Oh, yes, we include the participant stipends as mini grants to our student service program partners in anticipation of PIT implementation. Let's see. I have one last comment from Stephanie. Hey, Stephanie, agree that I appreciated, enjoyed Luca's presentation style, so much data presented in a great way. Thanks, Luca, and all for your work on this. Let's see. Okay, we're at 10:20. We're scheduled out until 10:30. I do want to have, provide you all an opportunity to share. I think it's best to just give it another quiet pause. And if not, we will definitely give you back some of your time. Yes, Cindy, I will work with Luca and team on a copy of the presentation. I will check in with them about that and about sharing the recording as well. But there will definitely be some follow-up messaging that goes out with resources for you all.
one of the things I really want to ask people is about this third question of really like what, when you think, because you have to build any kind of data collection effort around this basic concept of like, how do we identify what information is critical, and like how do we keep track of that? For us, we have a couple kind of goals. Like we find that overdose rates within our participant communities relative to the drugs they use is critical information. We need that information to be able to improve SSP services and resources. We want to know how many people are getting extra supplies, because that's critical to operating and improving SSPs. And what I'd love to hear from other folks is, even if you don't know how the question could be answered, when you think of the critical data that you would need, especially to better serve drug users or better link into harm reduction efforts, I'd love to hear people's ideas about kind of what those data points are, what those questions are. I kind of think of the prompt as like, damn, I wish I knew blank. Just like, damn, I wish I knew how many people in my community were smoking fentanyl rather than injecting it. I think, part of the way we can kind of expand the context for something like this is for people in different fields. I know a lot of you work kind of in public health, in epi, in advocacy, and I know everybody has their own little domain where it's like they have questions they need to have answered as a way of moving forward with this process of better and improved integration and linkage between all kinds of different groups doing different work.
Okay, there is the question about the data report, and if you can explain a little bit sort of like what is our report, and we still have some plans of do something more synthesize the data, if you can talk about that.
We have a larger report that goes through all of the results from it. I think Laura and folks from CDPH, we talked a little bit about ways in which we could share that, ways in which we could maybe kind of synthesize that down a little bit. But yeah, we do have those. We do have that resource available. We kind of, I think, are still figuring out exactly what the best way to share that and provide that is. One of the other ways that folks can connect data is Jessica has made this incredible infographic that that shows a lot of that visualizes a lot of the data we've collected, and we do want to share that with as many people as we can.
And just to reiterate, it's not a research per se, so that is why it still has not been kind of devised in a way that is a research report, but the infographic we definitely can share. And as we do, we probably will wait until the CHRI report 3, perhaps to do something more, something shareable with larger communities.
And also some, hopefully kind of what you've seen today can maybe also be a springboard to finding the larger amount of information that's out there. Like we've worked with a couple of people, and there's even a couple of people in this chat who I know have published interesting things on a lot of these changes. If you Google fentanyl smoking study, you'll find this kind of beginning of really interesting academic efforts to look at fentanyl smoking and its health outcomes. I guess, yeah, Marjorie, or there's 2 raised hands. Oh, Laura, you want to know. So yeah, Marjorie, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm gonna take advantage of your question and just say that I've been on a few calls in the last few weeks, and remind everybody that California is a housing first state. That might get lost sometimes. And what I've noticed is the frequency of these meetings have been about housing people who use drugs, and the frequency in which we discuss people getting kicked out of their housing because of having drugs on them or coming in under the influence. And I'm wondering if that is something we might be able to dive in deeper to just see some sort of reality check of how we're doing on that, because I'm fearful we're not doing well.
If you go out and ask people, that's one of those things where, again, like some of this is as easy, at least in the beginning, is as easy as just like a common sense kind of response. Like I oftentimes worry that people, they don't just go out and just ask drug users kind of really basic questions that would get great responses. If you go out and ask people, hey, what was it like? Have you lost your housing due to something that's drug related? You'll find lots of people who have that experience and who are willing to talk about it. Especially if you say especially if you can say honestly, that what information they share can be used to inform things that could hopefully end those practices in the near future.
I just want to echo though what Marjorie said, because I was just sitting yesterday in a panel for actually the state of Massachusetts, but any housing panel on harm reduction I am in, I realized that what we call fidelity to housing first and harm reduction really is not in the planning, is not even just basic overdose prevention in housing. So I don't know, Marjorie, there might be a call that we want to do that is much more specific, because I feel that that is a place where, and in California in particular, where we are compared to other states, you know, in some degree of housing first land, I feel that there's a lot of work to be done. And it's an incredible important intersection of the work of, you know, harm reduction, housing, behavioral health, overdose prevention. So we're ready when you're ready, Marjorie.
Yeah, and just to add to that as well, from talking to people in various states, from living in various states, from doing research in various places, I have never seen a place that is experiencing a housing crisis on the scale and of the impact of what's happening in California. And I think especially it's something I want to learn more about, because I grew up in California, but I left about 15, 20 years ago. And, you know, every time I come back, it is just the overwhelming reality of something terrible occurring within housing scarcity and stuff like that, that I think, you know, should propel it to the forefront of any discussion we have as a way of fulfilling that kind of housing first promise, at least.
Luca, I can't thank you enough. And as Laura put in the chat, I'm just going to read it. On behalf of NHRC and OA, we thank you all for who have joined today, and we definitely look forward to deepening our relationships and further resources for our communities. If you have any questions that you'd like to later ask us, we'll definitely have our email information in our follow-up messaging. And we do hope that y'all identified at least one good, maybe two nuggets from Luca. I know I definitely have. And yeah, thank you all for attending. Appreciate your participation, and look out for the follow-up messaging. And Luca and team, thank you again for sharing this information. I appreciate it all.
Thank you all so much for coming.
Yes. Have a good one all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.